I'm going to start this video with a reading of a poem, and hopefully the reason for its selection will become apparent during the discussion that follows. Abu Ben Adhem, may his tribe increase, awoke one night from a deep dream of peace, and saw, within the moonlight in his room, making it rich and like a lily in bloom, an angel writing in a book of gold. Exceeding peace had made Ben Adhem bold, and to the presence in the room he said, "What writest thou?" The vision raised its head, and with a look made of all sweet accord, answered, "The names of those who love the Lord." "And is mine one?" said Abu. "Nay, not so," replied the angel. Abu spoke more low, but cheerily still, and said, "I pray thee then, write me as one that loves his fellow men." The angel wrote, and vanished. The next night it came again with a great wakening light, and showed the names whom love of God had blessed, and lo, Ben Adhem's name led all the rest. Perhaps you've been hearing people discuss this topic. Is Putin like Hitler? Or why is Putin like Hitler? And who is Putler? In this video, I want to discuss 30 ways that I see the men being similar. And this will be very specific things. I'll try and call articles or little pieces of information and throw those into that discussion for each point as I run through them. Now, I want to preempt this video with a few warnings. The first is that I tend to meander a little bit. I don't have these written down in totality. I just have some points to run through, and I consider them as I go through the discussion. Second, I do consider myself to be a Christian, and I will run through some religious discussion here. Now, for me, that's a loose term, Christian. I do not adhere to a single faith, or a single religious group, I guess you should say. So, be warned that I will have that in here, and if that bothers anyone, I apologize in advance, but I think there are important points to be made religiously, because in many ways religion ties in with morality and ethics, and that's simply unavoidable in many cases, and I feel it's unavoidable in this case. Third, I'm going to be discussing a number of social issues that apply to the modern times, and perhaps that will be bothersome to some people. I apologize if that is the case, but I'm going to run through this. And fourth, I will state ahead of time that this is an opinion piece in many ways. Now, there are reasoned opinions, and there are opinions that are built upon logic and reason, and there are opinions that are not. Hopefully, by the time I'm finished with this, I will have gone through a considered, rational approach to this topic. And finally, perhaps most importantly to many, this is a topic that is not something that should be done shallowly. This is something that needs to be done with reverence, because of the sacrifices of so many people and all of the suffering that's tied within this topic itself. This is a very deep topic, and it's one that I think shouldn't just be waded into whimsically and not taken seriously. So I hope to provide a thoughtful and wise consideration of this topic, and I hope to add value, and hopefully through this discussion it will enable an understanding of this, and not only of this specific comparison, but of the nature of dynamics as they occur, that will help other people, and hopefully will help situations in the future, so that we don't have to have this constantly being discussed. So, let's take a look at a few things. The first is, of course, people will say, how can Hitler be like Putin? Hitler was, of course, a socialist, and Putin was, of course, a communist. Now, that's extremely simple. It's an oversimplification, and in many cases it's deliberate. Of course, Hitler was a member of and then the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It has socialist right there in the name. But of course, Hitler wasn't, in the end, really much of a socialist. And Putin, of course, isn't really much of a communist. And I'll go through this discussion a bit later, if you're familiar with these two men. Now, the nature of giving something a name in order to control it is discussed by Alan Watts. I'll link his video about the illusion of control that's tied with classification of words. It's an after-school video. Some people will discuss these two men and say, well, they're both fascists. And I suppose. I mean, everyone is entitled to their opinion. For me, neither one of these men is a fascist. Now, Mr. Ryan Chapman has a video, and it's a good video. I suggest you watch it, where he defines the fascist movement. Essentially, he gives an intellectual history of modern fascism in the 20th century. Again, he's running through a very tight discussion about very specific things, and while it's worthwhile, I don't think it's necessary. Why? Well, because I can prove to you that neither of these men is a fascist. And it's not a very difficult thing to do. And neither was Mussolini, by the way. Let's look at the word fascist. It's a word that's composed of two ideas. The first is the fasces. Now, the fasces is a bundle of rods that signifies the power of the magistrate of Rome. The second portion of the word is ist. And ist means a follower of something, a follower of some philosophy or system or something. So are these men followers? I guess it's possible to be a leader and a follower at the same time. But certainly if a person is just following their own whims, they're not following anything other than themselves. That's exactly what all three of those men did. They simply followed their own whim. So they can't be fascists. They're not followers of anything. So, let's discuss the first portion of the word fascist, fasces. And we'll come back to this a little bit later on, and it'll become apparent why I want to discuss this. Now, the bundle of rods that was used to signify the power of the magistrate in first the kingdom and then the republic and finally the empire of Rome. And I want you to note the evolution over time there. It's important. The kingdom, the democracy, and finally the empire. Some people argue that there are life cycles of governments that are inherent. It's an interesting one there. This bundle of rods, of course, rods were used to punish, as noted in Proverbs 13:24. A bundle of rods signifies the ability of the authorities to punish people. And if there's an axe within that bundle of rods, it includes the power to sentence people to death. It's that simple. It's extremely simple. I'd like to point you to the card, the tarot card, the Ten of Wands. This image is also used by Led Zeppelin. It's not exactly the same, but you can take a look at it. And if you consider the nature of the meaning of the card, the peasant being weighed down by a bundle of rods that are being carried somewhere, very likely as a means of punishment or pain, then you kind of understand the nature of why it's being included there in that album. You'll have to kind of consider that on your own. So, for me, then, the term fascist is extremely simple. A fascist is a follower of power. A fascist is a person who is willing to allow other people to be killed in the name of power. That's the only justification that's necessary, is that power says they should die. And a fascist follower allows that to happen. They believe that that's acceptable. That's the only justification that's necessary. There's no right or wrong. There is simply authority. And if authority says something should be a certain way, then that has to be accepted. For me, that's the definition of what a fascist is. So, let's take a look at a person that I consider to be fairly important. His name is Epictetus. I'd like to read you a section from How to Be Free, or the Enchiridion. This is paragraph 33, or point 33. I don't really know how this book is broken down. Draw up, right now, a definite character and identify for yourself one that you intend to stick to, whether you are by yourself or in company. Stay mainly silent, or keep your conversation to the necessary minimum. On rare occasions, though, when the situation calls for it, engage in talk, but not about trite topics like gladiators or horse races or athletes or food or drink. The things that come up all the time. And above all, don't talk critically or flatteringly or judgmentally about people. By your own conversation, if you can, guide your friends' talk in a fitting direction. But if you find yourself all alone amongst strangers, stay silent. Now, if you're familiar with Epictetus, for me, he's what I would consider to be an alpha male. And alpha males are, I don't know, that's kind of a term that's gotten popular in time. For me, simply, he is what he said he is. He's free. How to be free? Well, how to be free is kind of driven by a person deciding who they are and sticking to it. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being male or female, but it does have a lot to do with being free. And it can be very rewarding, of course, to be free. And this is a discussion that we all have to have internally. Who are we? What are our core beliefs? And each person should go through this and decide for themselves what are their beliefs. Decide who you are and stick to it, even though it means you might lose money, or you might lose social standing, or you might lose possessions, you might lose friends and family. But you have to stick to what you believe is right. And I feel that there's enough similarity in people that if everyone did this, you might find that their decisions would be remarkably similar. So, that's enough of an introduction. Let's move to the very first point. How is Putin like Hitler? Point number 1. Losers in a lost country. Now, both of these men I would consider to be losers. Now, not only are they losers, but their entire countries were losers at the time of their youth. Now, I use the term youth somewhat loosely here. There is an impact on an individual if they are humiliated, and there is an impact on a nation if they are humiliated. So let's consider the nature of the difficulties of their lives and the nature of the difficulties of their nation's lives without passing judgment, without saying that, well, you get what you deserve or whatever. Let's just simply consider the nature of humiliation and loss, difficulty, and how that can impact a person's life over time. Now, first, I'm going to give you a reading. There is that scattereth, and yet increaseth, and there is that withholdeth more than is meet. But it tendeth to poverty. The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself. Now this is Proverbs 16:24 through 25. I just want to preempt this with that discussion. Hitler was born April 20th, 1889, in Austria. His father was a failed farmer and abused him. Hitler was often beaten by his own father. I've read in some places that he had to be taken to the hospital. He was beaten so badly. I'm not making excuses for the man that he would become later. I'm simply pointing out the facts of Hitler's youth. In 1900, he had a brother that died, Edmund. In 1903, his father died. In 1907, his mother died of breast cancer. Now, his mother was a devout Catholic, and she was the one that stood up for him for almost all his life. And I suppose you could argue that if Hitler ever did love anyone in particular, it likely was his mother. So, note the time frame there. From 1889 to 1907, this boy, and I will call him a boy because at that time he would have only been 18 years old, has suffered and lost everything. When you look at pictures of Hitler in his as a boy, what do you see in his face? I see a scared little boy. It's hard to know what someone will grow up into, but given the nature of the difficulty of his early life, I think most people would look at him later and say, perhaps, that would make a person a very hard person. It would make them a person that, because they had suffered, was willing to accept the suffering of others very easily. Just an assumption, just an opinion, but it's a thought. He would go on to serve in World War I. He had been a failed artist, and of course World War I ended in a loss. Now, most of the material that I've read on Hitler said that he was fairly courageous as a soldier, and perhaps didn't believe that the Germans necessarily had to lose, or that they had been betrayed. There was a sense of betrayal amongst the Germans at that time, that if they could have held out, they could have had a better peace or something. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was noteworthy for being fairly harsh. Of course, most of World War I was fought in France, and most of the damage was in France. So the French were quite upset at the end of World War I, and they sought to make the Germans pay for their loss. Also seems justifiable, doesn't it? After World War I was finished, Hitler stayed on with the army for a little bit and got involved in politics. All ended there. But this would be around 1918 to 1899 to about 1919. There is nothing in Hitler's life but loss, privation, humiliation, destruction, pain, and suffering. I'm sure he had some enjoyable moments in his life, but it's hard to point to anything positive in that man's life. It really is. Let's look at Putin. Another loser and a humiliated nation. I look at, again, let's look at his face. What do we see in his face? Again, I see a scared little boy. Now, both of these boys, over time, they develop a very hard exterior look. A very kind of cold, calculating look. And for me, that's disconcerting, because of course people reflect what they see in the world, and they often do that in their face. So, let's look at Putin. Born 7 October 1952 in Leningrad after the war. Now, if you're familiar with World War II, you are aware of the siege of Leningrad. What you may not be aware of is that the siege of Leningrad was responsible for the death, you could say, of Putin's brother, his older brother. In 1942, his brother died of diphtheria. There were terrible conditions in Leningrad, and his brother either wasn't able to get treatment or contracted diphtheria due to the siege of Leningrad. His father was terribly wounded in 1942, and although I guess you could say there are certain deprivations in Putin's early life, I would say that it appears, at least, that his life was not quite so entirely destructive as a youth as Hitler's had been. Now, Putin studied law and joined the Communist Party, became a KGB agent, and eventually got into politics. So, not a whole lot kind of going on there. Obviously, with the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1990, this again would impact Putin in a negative way. So these two men, to a large degree, I would say, have not had a whole lot of success early in their lives. Much more so the case with Mr. Hitler than with Mr. Putin. So, here are some side thoughts I guess I should point to really quickly before we move off of this point. The first is, there is a Duke rat study which makes links between morphine addiction, eventually, and neglect in childhood. There also is an article, The Effects of Child Abuse and Neglect for Adult Survivors. I'll link both of these in the description, and I'll give a little bit of information here. The important thing, I think, to note is that there are tendencies that each of us face due to how we grew up, how we were raised, and what we were exposed to as infants, and as toddlers and as children. And each of us has to overcome the difficulties that are caused by those experiences. Now, if we're extremely lucky, we have a caregiver that is able to provide most of the necessities, but no one's perfect, and everyone has to go through this process of self-evaluation and self-improvement in order to cover for some of the difficulties that we all will face from childhood. That's a natural part of the process of becoming a well-balanced adult. The importance of this article on the effects of child abuse and neglect for adult survivors, and the importance of this latest rat study, are, of course, that if we do not deal with these problems, they will follow us, and they won't simply just go away. They will manage to impair our ability to function as adults throughout our lives. So, a couple of takeaways really quickly. This is why it's so important to have assistance for people that need it, particularly for children. It's important to have social assistance and programs for them available, because there are many children that do suffer and need the assistance, and that benefits all of us in the long run. Let's look at the second point. For the second point, I want to point out to you that both of these men were government workers, essentially. Hitler was a soldier in World War I. He had been a failed applicant to the Vienna School of Art, I believe. After 1918, he became an agent. He stayed with the army in Munich and was termed an intelligence officer. His job was essentially to spy on and infiltrate the DAP, or the German Workers' Party. Eventually that would become the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party. Essentially, the Nazi Party was a socialist group that was anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, and anti-communist. Isn't that interesting? Anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, and anti-communist. They were a pro-nationalist German first party, and within a Geimlich letter in 1919 espoused the removal of Jews from Germany. In 1920, Hitler was eventually discharged and was able to join the Nazi Party full-time. Now, there were a large number of war veterans that were part of this German Workers' Party, and I suppose I should just kind of point out really quickly here that throughout Hitler's life now, he has only really known one way of getting paid reliably, and that is by working for the government. Okay, let's look at Putin. Now, not much is known of Putin's youth, really. He's managed to hide quite a bit of it. In 1975, he joined the KGB. He went to KGB training in Leningrad. Not much is known about that. From 85 to 90, he was an agent in Dresden, and he speaks German. Either he learned it there, or was taught it, or studied it prior. He resigned as a lieutenant colonel in 91, and did odd jobs until joining politics. Again, almost entirely a government worker. Now, why do I keep bringing that up? Well, I'm going to give you a quote. You may recall that Napoleon called England a nation of shopkeepers. He is recorded as, he went on to be recorded as saying, by that, what was he intending to say? Okay, so why am I discussing this point of these two men being largely government workers? And I'm going to compare that now to this quote of Napoleon calling England a nation of shopkeepers. This is what Napoleon is recorded as saying. I meant that you were a nation of merchants, and that all your great riches and your grand resources arose from commerce. No man of sense ought to be ashamed of being called a shopkeeper. Well said. So let's consider the nature of the power of his statement. In many ways, I think you could argue that a merchant is responsible for being able to do a number of things, one of which is get along with people as a general rule, at least with their customers. So the ability to organize things and plan things and develop ties of commerce over time, to be innovative, to be conservative simultaneously with money. These are all aspects of successful merchants. They are important qualities to develop in a person over time. For this reason, you could argue that a government that is strongly influenced by merchants would logically be predisposed to success. And this certainly is the case throughout history in many, many cases. Most noteworthy is, I guess you could say, Carthage. So, what is the danger of having these kind of career men, I suppose you could say, that were governmental in mindset? Well, I'll give you an example. There's a CNN article. Putin tells Siberia officials to do better versus fires. So if you're familiar with this, if you're familiar with that topic, essentially there are a number of fires happening in Siberia. This has been a problem for a while now. And, well, how would you handle something like that? Do you utilize the resources of your country and your bureaucracy to provide money and resources and a methodology to correct a problem? Or do you simply say, well, do better. Do better than fix it. You go fix it. Fix it yourself. Make this problem go away for me. I don't know what to do. I don't want to think about it. etc. In many ways, a merchant that has that kind of philosophy wouldn't be in business very long. Because a merchant understands intrinsically, a businessman understands intrinsically, if they're a legitimate businessman and not simply some form of figurehead, that those types of decisions are important and they are comfortable with the idea of allocating resources to correct problems, to maintain the capability of whatever it is that they're running. That's intrinsic to being a good businessman. And in my opinion, this is the importance of small businesses, that it teaches this skill to many people, how to manage. Let's look at the third point I'd like to bring up. Traders. Both of these men are traders. And as I broke down in the introduction, I don't feel that either one of them adheres to any particular philosophy. Well, let's prove it right here. First off, we know Hitler turned against his own government for his party. The Nazis were essentially a revolutionary party. By committing the act of sedition, he is showing that he's not loyal to his own country. Now, the Weimar Republic, you could argue, was a weak republic and that it was flawed and it had problems. But the nature of revolution is intrinsically tied to the idea of being a traitor to your own country, particularly if that's a democratically elected government. Now, you could argue, well, he was loyal to his party, wasn't he? No, he wasn't. He wasn't even loyal to his own party. And this is demonstrated by the destruction of the SA. The SA, who many would argue is actually the socialist group within the Nazi Party, was headed by Ernst Röhm. Now, Ernst Röhm was widely considered to be a socialist, and I've read anyway that he was considered to be a homosexual. He was dedicated to the party. Now, this man in the SA would eventually be destroyed. And his removal was tied to Hitler getting promoted within the German government. Now, the nature of this betrayal of his own party was, I guess you could say, caused by Hitler's desire to be named as the secondary chancellor of Germany, or the heir to the chancellorship of Germany. And this kind of was a deal that showed that he was willing to remove his own military branch of brown shirts, the SA, and accept the authorities that were in existence at the time within the German government. It is a compromise of sorts between the members of his own party and the government. And he chose to destroy members of his own party in order to further his own career. Now, eventually Goebbels, I don't know how to say his name, I don't really care, would emphasize the moral lacking of Ernst Röhm and his followers, and use that as justification for the destruction of these people. In other words, the fact, or perhaps simply the slander that was generated, calling certain members of the SA as homosexuals is extremely convenient, because at that point in time, of course, that was not something that was widely considered to be approved of by the population. So that would provide some form of moral justification for their destruction, for their murder. What about Putin? Well, in 1999, Putin called communism a blind alley far away from the mainstream of civilization. He would resign after a coup attempt against the government and become reportedly a taxi driver, and eventually be appointed head of the FSB in '98 by Yeltsin. And this is all tied to corruption charges that were kind of, I guess you could say, being considered against Yeltsin and the Yeltsin family at the time. So, why is this important? Well, obviously, Putin had destroyed a number of records. He was a member of the KGB. He undoubtedly saved quite a few lives and certainly hid quite a bit of information that existed at his fingertips anyway. And for that form of loyalty to a sub-organization, not to his nation, to a form of loyalty to a sub-organization within his own government, he was a traitor. Because the people had decided to remove a corrupt government, and the vestiges of that corrupt government deserved to be punished. They deserved to be reviewed and punished. And anyone who hid those records from their own people was a traitor. That's exactly what he did. So, he would be rewarded for this by the same structures that he helped to save, that were never fully punished and removed after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he would eventually become the head of the FSB and eventually utilize that position to become president of Russia again. So, what exactly are these men loyal to? Well, we've proven now. Their loyalty is only to themselves, to power structure as it suits them. As a side article on this issue, I will point you to an article / video that was made by MSNBC and Rachel Maddow concerning the topic of elimination rhetoric and how Putin has consistently been using accusations of sexual impropriety as justification for the elimination of his rivals. It is a good video. I suggest you watch it.
Are there any queers in the audience tonight? Get them up against the wall! Yes! There's one in the spotlight, you're not afraid! Have them up against the wall! Yes! And no one looks Jewish! And no one's a clown! They are let all this riff-raff into the room!
Let's look at the fourth similarity between these two individuals. Violent writings and their hidden tendencies. Now, Hitler, of course, wrote Mein Kampf. I won't be reviewing that disgusting book. I will never read that disgusting book. I will give you one point about Hitler and his violent tendencies. Hitler had a love interest before Eva Braun. Her name was Geli Rabal. In September of 1931, she committed suicide with Hitler's gun, supposedly, in his Munich apartment. Now, she was accused by some, I guess by him, of cheating on him or going around and kind of, I guess she had a boyfriend. There was a military guy she was interested in, if I recall correctly. Now, I'll have to excuse, I may make noises from time to time. I'm still getting over COVID, wonderfully. So, I certainly have had time to consider these topics, but also I'm still not feeling very well, and I still cough and kind of have issues with that. So anyway, back on topic. Gelly who was not only a relation of Hitler, but also a love interest of Hitler. Fairly strange. How does she have Hitler's gun? And how does she kill herself? I don't know. I mean, I guess it's possible. But there's some really weird stuff going on there. It's highly suspicious and very strange. And that's in 31. Okay. What about Putin? Well, he has written previously, when a fight is inevitable, you must strike first. This is written October 23rd, 2015. This type of philosophy, of course, you can argue that when a fight is inevitable, you have to strike first. Sure, you can make that argument, I guess. The problem is that there never is an inevitability of a fight until someone strikes first. There is a possibility of a fight, but there's always the possibility of a fight. There is never an inevitability of anything. Things are probable or highly probable or less probable. But even two people screaming into each other's faces from 2 inches apart are not destined to fight. Are they? No, it's not a foregone conclusion. People can have arguments without fighting. In fact, Putin's statement indicates that he is predisposed towards fighting, mentally. Or perhaps he just wishes to give that appearance. Okay, so let's consider a few things about Putin really quickly. We know he's into judo. Isn't that interesting? He also likes hockey. He speaks German. What a strange person. Just consider that. Okay? Who did the Russians fight in World War II? Who are the Russians fighting that were responsible for the death of his brother? The Germans. Why is he learning German? And just consider that. Shouldn't there be a part of you that doesn't want to have anything to do with Germany? If you're resentful of all the pain and suffering that they've caused your family, the disfigurement of your father, the death of your brother, and yet you'll go serve in Germany, in Dresden, you'll learn German. Now perhaps that's simply to study the enemy. Okay. Is that what's happening with judo? Russia was at war with Japan as well, weren't they? Yes, they were. Judo is a martial art, of course, and it's significant, not just because it's a martial art, but because it's the martial art of an enemy. Why doesn't Putin study Kung Fu? I don't know. I mean, ask yourself that question. Kung Fu is Chinese. If you want to study a martial art, why not study a martial art that's in line with one of your allies? In fact, his choices appear to be indicating someone that is constantly at war. Considering the nature of war and the history of the country, instead of studying and learning things about countries that are in line with your own country. You could do that with Kung Fu. You could even do it with Taekwondo. There isn't really a direct history of violence between the Koreans and the Russians. Why not study Taekwondo? No, he studied German and judo for a reason. And that's because he is internally at war. Very likely. It could just be random. Of course, it could be random. But, you decide. What do you think? Now, there are a number of kind of considerations, I guess you could say, of predisposition towards violence. Or, I guess you could say violent writings, violent kind of tendencies. Now, Boris Nemtsov was an opposition party and critic of the government, shot dead, 27 February 2015. That's all you need to know. Now, who exactly did it? You can always kind of pretend it wasn't you. But most people know who it was. Who's responsible for that? There's been enough assassinations now that there's no doubt who this man is. And that was in 2015. 7 years ago. And there were things before that as well, of course. Now, there are people that believe that the Chechen War was precipitated by a false flag operation that involved bombing his own people in order to develop outcry to justify the Chechen War. Another indication of someone who's willing to be extremely violent to get what they want. And duplicitous. Let's look at point number 5. The egomaniac mask. Now, by this term, I simply mean that these two men have a practiced form of expression over time. And while it's somewhat different, it's extremely similar in the fact that it is not an individual. It is a representation of an ideal. Let's consider Mr. Hitler first. First, his many speeches, his anger, his disgust, his caricature of himself as a zealot. He became a vegan. Interesting. He stopped smoking as a waste. Yet this man was entirely drug addicted over time. He has in some ways become a fool. And I've heard many people make the comparison to other politicians, including American politicians, as being a fool. And I would like to read something to you about the fool. So let's look at the fool. Now, this is from a dictionary of symbols by J.E. Cirlot. And I do recommend that you get this book. This is the most important book I've ever owned. It is a fair discussion of all symbols. So, the fool. This is, let me give you some information about the book before I start. This is the second edition of a dictionary of symbols. Routledge and Kegan Paul Limited, London, 1962. I'm on page 111. The Fool. The logic of the process is clear enough. When the normal or conscious appears to become infirm or perverted, in order to regain health and goodness, it becomes necessary to turn to the dangerous, the unconscious, and the abnormal. Further, the fool and the clown, as Fraser has pointed out, play the part of scapegoats in the ritual sacrifice of humans. The fool. There are a number of extremely difficult topics that are discussed within that definition of the fool. And both of these men are playing that idea, the fool. They're turning to the unconscious to twist it. Now, in Hitler's case, he's utilizing unbridled anger and disgust. He's utilizing those emotions to turn people into something that is desirable for him, for his ability to seize and maintain control of power. For Putin, he's using an extremely cold and calculating mask to pretend to be almost like I guess you could say, a cold-blooded, judgmental man. I'm hesitant to even call him a man at this point. But he's using a cold and calculating mask to portray what he thinks he should be and what he thinks he wants his own people to see in order to affect them. There is a Business Insider article. Former Trump advisor, Putin had an odd smell. It was all staged. Let's discuss Carl Jung just really quickly. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. By Carl Jung. We've discussed this already. The shadow that's tied, the dark aspects of each one of us, good and bad in each person. Hitler's shadow is rage and disgust. Putin's shadow is cold, calculating logic. That is what they wish to be consumed by. That is what they wish to portray to their followers and to the world. Here's another quote. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and baser it is. So, if a person does not come to terms with the negative experiences and aspects of themselves, the darker that shadow becomes over time. Now this is important because I suppose what you could say is considered to be a weak thing to do by many considering males. We've already discussed this strange idea of the alpha male being strong and all these types of things. We can see that there's a dynamic that doesn't make sense here. In other words, in a violent world, in a violent experience, a natural reaction is to do whatever it takes to avoid that. Generally speaking, that means learning how to be incredibly strong. Not performing self-review. Essentially, a person learns to ignore their own pain and control it, avoid it, but not guide it and understand it. That lack of understanding feeds the shadow. That's why it requires conscious effort for each person to deal with the shadow of their own lives in order to become a more positive member of society. And when I hear people and politicians that are feeding the shadows, the negativities, the subconscious negativities of us all, it's extremely alarming. And that's what both of these men have been doing. So, here's an example. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, that's what a lot of young men are being told is manly. This idea that you go out and shoot people. Now, I'm not going to say that there isn't some aspect or positivity that's tied to defending yourself. But when you have people that really don't really seem to be evaluating themselves and aren't necessarily conscious of their own development, they think that simply going out and pretending to be a powerful person because you own a rifle, particularly in my country right now, this is a real big problem. There are a lot of young men that are just kind of lost, and they don't know how to actually become a successful male. That's, to me, what an alpha male is. An alpha male is simply a successful male. That's what an alpha anything is, male or female, successful. Now, the terms of that success are defined by the individual and attempted to be defined by society to a large degree. But if someone is to actually be successful in their life, they have to determine what success means to them. It can't be simply pointed out to them. A person can't simply go buy a gun and become a successful human, a balanced human, contributing member of society. It requires a painful process of self-review. The masks used by these two men remind me quite a bit of the character Pink in The Wall. I did do a breakdown of Did Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd The Wall? And I discussed that film quite a bit. And this very topic seems to be intrinsic to that movie. This idea of becoming a maniac, a person possessed by your own mask, your own shadow mask, over time. And you could argue, of course, that a singer is very similar to a politician. They're putting on a show, perhaps consumed by the character they invent for their own show over time. And that mask, that mask can either be, pardon me, that mask can either be embraced or recognized and thrown away as dangerous. Who a person is actually going to be to attain success, individual success, needs to be something much deeper than simply finding a character or a mask to portray that people want to see and hear. It's damaging not just to the people getting the message, it's also damaging to the person who is delivering that message. Let's read Epictetus again. If you want to make progress, don't mind appearing foolish and silly while outward things are concerned, and don't wish to appear an expert. Even if some people think you are somebody, distrust yourself. It is not easy, you can be sure, to keep your own will in harmony with nature and simultaneously secure outward things. If you care about the one, you are completely bound to neglect the other. That's the danger of the world. That's the difficulty of the world. How to develop yourself inwardly as well as outwardly at the same time. It's very difficult to do. We'll get into this a little bit later when we discuss the Beatitudes of Jesus. He discusses that very idea, that it's very difficult to serve the development of inner peace and outward satisfaction. Let's look at a sixth point of similarity between these two men. Limited family. Now this is direct family. Of course, we already discussed the nature of Hitler's family's deaths. He did have with him for a long time Eva Braun, They did eventually commit suicide, and never married, and did not have kids, supposedly. Putin himself has very few pictures. He does have 2 confirmed daughters, and one that is supposedly his daughter, via a mistress, I believe. He was married from 83 to 2013. And in 2008, there was a report of his mistress and engagement within a newspaper, and of course that newspaper was immediately shut down. He does not seem to spend much time with his own family, including his own daughters. As a side note, I will notice that the German Secret Service noted that Mr. Putin was a philanderer or a womanizer. And we have to ask then, what is the nature of these 2 men? Why do they not seem to be accepting the natural role of a father figure? Now, if you're familiar with Hitler, you will recognize that supposedly one of the reasons that he gave Eva Braun for not marrying her was that he was married to the country, married to the job, or whatever they want to call it. I don't know. But there may be something more to the idea of not actually being a family man and being kind of a leader that is afraid to embrace the natural order of life for them. They've chosen partners. Why wouldn't they embrace that partnership and choose to rule in a kind of a sharing fashion, as a, I don't know what you would call that, as a married couple, as a family? Well, one of my favorite stories about Abraham Lincoln is a story of him getting down on the ground and playing with his kids, and being in meetings and having his rambunctious kids kind of running around, interrupting meetings and playing and joking around with their father as he's trying to run the country. And of course, for the United States, Lincoln was running the country during its most tumultuous time up to date, the Civil War. And yet he still is embracing his role as a father. For me, that's an ideal leader. And he had to make a lot of very difficult decisions. And in many ways, Abraham Lincoln was incredibly strong. And he guided the country through a very violent time. And he had to give orders that he knew would result in the deaths of many men. Many people would die due to the orders of Abraham Lincoln. And yet he still embraced the nature of his role as a father. Let's take another reading. This is from Society of the Spectacle by Debord. The images detached from every aspect of life fuse in a common stream, in which the unity of this life can no longer be re-established. Reality considered partially unfolds in its own general unity, as a pseudo-world apart, an object of mere contemplation. The specialization of images of the world is completed in the world of the autonomous image, where the liar has lied to himself. The spectacle in general, as the concrete inversion of life, is the autonomous movement of the non-living. Now there's a lot happening within that paragraph, but certainly you can recognize a few things. One is the idea of an image, trying to maintain an image, and how it is a lie, and how a liar will lie to themselves in order to maintain an image. And you can say what you want about Abraham Lincoln, but certainly I think Abraham Lincoln knew who he was. That's the mark of a free person. Let's move on to the next point. Bad students. Okay. Well, neither one of these men seems to be incredibly inclined to learning. I don't know much of Mr. Adolf Hitler's records as a youth, but he did fail his fine arts entry into Vienna. I have read a quote by him that he didn't really like to read books beginning to end. He would simply read the beginning and the ending, and felt that was a particularly acceptable way of understanding what was within that book. So, supposedly, Hitler was kind of an evil genius. Well, was he? I don't know. I mean, maybe he was incredibly intelligent. I don't know. But certainly, as far as academics is involved, I'm not aware of a whole lot of capability on his part. Let's take a look at A Little Learning is a Dangerous Thing by Alexander Pope. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pyrenean spring. There shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. Fired at first sight with what the muse imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the heights of arts. While from the bounded level of our mind short views we take, nor see the lengths behind, but more advanced behold with strange surprise new distant scenes of endless science rise. So pleased at first the towering Alps we try, mount o'er the vales and seem to tread the sky, and the first clouds and mountains seem the last. But those attained, we tremble to survey the growing labors of the lengthened way. The increasing prospects tire our wandering eyes, hills peep o'er hills, and Alps on Alps arise. That was a fairly long poem. I guess I should apologize for that. Kind of a long aside to the topic. The importance is, of course, that in learning, and I don't want to pretend that learning only matters when it concerns books. This is one of the fallacies of men like Nietzsche, that believe because they are intelligent in books and language, that they possess wisdom. But wisdom is something that is gained through a lot of learning. And wisdom is what's necessary for people to be successful, and for societies to be successful. They must possess wise citizens. The development of wisdom is a very painful process. Again, most people don't want to confront the shadows, not just of themselves, but of other people. But that's what's necessary to allow for the development of self and for the development of society to be positive over time. So, bad students, bad learning. How is Putin a bad student? Well, if you're familiar with Putin, you know that he had studied to become a lawyer. Well, apparently his thesis was plagiarized. What kind of a student plagiarizes their own thesis? Well, one that's studying something that they don't care about, perhaps. Or perhaps someone who's learning simply as a means to something else and doesn't value the process itself. What do you think is happening there? So, what's the problem here? Well, one of the problems is, of course, that these men seek to increase their power exponentially. And yet, we recognize that increase in power would require an increase in knowledge and wisdom as well, in order to manage that power, would it not? And yet, in both of these men, we see very little desire to increase knowledge and wisdom. And yet they're seeking vast increases in power. That's a very, very dangerous mixture. That's the nature of dictators in general. It's the source of the statement, have your cake and eat it too. That a person only wants what they consider to be the positive aspects of power. They do not want to be responsible, and they do not want to put in the effort and work necessary to effectively manage the totality of a dictatorship. In many ways, you could argue it's almost impossible. In some ways, you could say someone that did try to do so in certain ways was Napoleon. He actually was concerned with things like the legal system in his own country. But these two men, you would have to almost be a fool to trust them with power, because their only interest is in more power. Now, I'm concerned, of course, as an American citizen, as a citizen of the United States, because I would like to see effective leadership. Not just in Russia, but in the United States as well. Okay, so this is going to be a big one. We're getting into some of the much heavier topics now. Similarity number 8. Use of ethnic history and nationalism. Now this is going to be a fairly complex one. It's going to involve a lot of discussion and points, so please be patient. Now the first point to make is that Hitler, of course, is well understood to be someone that was utilizing the argument of ethnic history as justification for many of his actions. Specifically, the Anschluss, or the joining of German people, was utilized to justify the taking of the Sudetenland, the taking of Austria in 1938. This occurred from March to September of 38. And we should note that, quite paradoxically, I suppose, that a portion of the territory that was seized by the Germans was also seized by Poland. And of course, this is a form of corruption, the stealing of land that is often utilized by governments based on nationality to increase their power and decrease their boundaries. And we all know what happens to Poland later. And part of the reason for this justification is Danzig, the Germanic people within Danzig. This occurred in October of 39. Hitler is quoted as stating, "For us, it is a matter of expanding our Lebensraum in the East." So, there we see the lack of identification of boundaries and borders, and simply a desire to attain space, to attain more land. Well, Putin has done something quite similar, hasn't he? He's taken Crimea, he's invaded the Donbass, he's facilitated the taking of Transnistria, and all of these policies of the great connecting of the Russian people follows a Soviet plan under Stalin to distribute Russians in the area to facilitate Soviet power. Now, one of the wonderful things about Crimea, in my opinion, is and Ukraine as well, I should say, is the wonderful, diverse ethnic history of all the different people that have been through that area, through history, from Greeks to Tartars to Turks to Jews, of course to Russians and Ukrainians, movement of people through that region has been consistent through time, and in a way, they're kind of that area is kind of a melting pot of people in history. Also, Roma, I should mention, the Roma are a significant population within Ukraine. In 1999 to 2000, the Russians attacked Chechnya. In 2000, they attacked Georgia. 2014, they attacked Crimea. And of course now is the general invasion of Ukraine. This has been a consistent policy of Putin over time. This is 20 years of invasions, subjugation of peoples, and attacks on borders. Consider all that time and all the different representatives of Western governments that have done nothing. You can impose, I don't know, whatever minuscule sanctions they wish to impose, but the truth is that Western money continues to flow into Russia and has always flowed into Russia throughout this time. So, what is the danger here? Well, obviously, the danger is that both of these men have utilized the taking of land to consolidate and grow their power base. And that desire does not fade in time. There is no end to this. This is demonstrated by Hitler's comment in September of 1938. The Sudetenland is, quote, the last territorial demand, period, of his regime, which obviously was a lie all along. There was no end to Hitler's territorial demands. There will be no end to Putin's territorial demands. So let's look at a number of side topics and consider them, I suppose, as they are relevant to this particular point. The first is that there is an Al Jazeera video on Russian courts sentencing Crimean Muslims to jail. Of course, Tatars are largely Muslim, and they have been singled out in Crimea for jailing and removal. As a practice, this is a form of genocide. I will discuss that a little bit later on. I should also point out that not only are Tatars fighting against the Russians in this case, but also the Roma and the Jews recognize the danger of this form of warfare, and many of them are dutifully serving the Ukrainian army, which for me at least is heartening to see that so many people recognize the danger of what is occurring. Another point I think that people should consider is the history of Russia. In 1833, Tsar Nicholas I issued the three guiding principles of Russia, of the Russian regime. Those principles are 1. Orthodoxy, 2. Autocracy, and 3. Nationality. Those are the 3 points of existence, in his view, for continued successful existence of his own personal regime. And he tied that, of course, to the existence of Russia itself. Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. We have to understand that this is the history of not only Russia and the regime itself, but also of the Russian people. They have been experiencing this type of mentality and been subjected to it. for almost 200 years. Let's take a look at another point. The establishment of camps. This is extremely distressing to many people. Of course, the Nazis were famous for setting up their extermination camps and their work camps. But the Chinese, of course, have also been doing this with the Uyghur camps, their re-education camps, as they're called. No eyes on them. There have been leaks of things happening within these camps, and I'm certain that we will never know the full extent of damage to individuals that is occurring to an entire population of Uyghurs within those camps. And what do you know? The Russians have been establishing camps for Ukrainians that are being moved into Russia. Let's discuss for a moment another point. A man named Ivan Ilyin. This man is reputed to be an influence upon Mr. Putin. He is a Russian nationalist writer, a fascist nationalist writer. He describes a future Russian state that is his ideal state. What is the nature of that future Russian state? It is Christo-fascist. That is his desire. We have to assume, as he is an influence on Mr. Putin, that Mr. Putin may be in agreement that that is exactly what he is seeking to do. Now, one of the things that's happened here within the United States is this garbage of replacement theory, and I won't even mention the ridiculous correspondent who's been promoting these ideas, the disgusting individual. I won't mention his name. But these ideas of replacement are a form of genocide. When they are true, unfortunately, within my country, people assume these things to be true. We have evidence that they are actually occurring in other states currently, like Ukraine. There has been a long policy, as we mentioned, by the Soviets to move Russians into Ukraine. That's happened for 80 years. One would have to start to wonder if the eventual takeover of Ukraine, the pacification, the uniformification of the culture and the populace wasn't something that was planned over time. Now, there was a point in time where the Soviets pointed to the Tatars as an extremely model-worthy culture, and obviously that no longer suits their purposes, so that line of thought has changed dramatically. So, let's look at another point. Is it possible, then, that what is happening in Russia is actually a form of racism? Now, there is a history of Russians utilizing immigration as a form of weapon. People have been transported from the Middle East to Belarus to be moved into the Polish, across the Polish border and into Poland. This has been paid for by someone. They weren't getting free tickets to Belarus. How are they getting there? And how are they being pushed into Poland? Simultaneously, one would have to ask, why is there a concern amongst Russians or amongst the Russian elite with Ukraine? Well, Ukraine is a border with a number of people and different cultures and ethnicities. These people may be considered by the elites of Russia to be undesirable. And for that reason, they would like to secure the border through Ukraine, simply as a form of migration control. That may be something that's happening. And although, of course, it may simply be a political, economic, and geographic attempt to seize power and control borders, it may also be a preemptive control of that border, because the likelihood of future migration may be a concern for them. This, of course, is extremely similar to the situation in the United States, where some people have become extremely preoccupied with our own southern border. And that often is due to cultural, ethnic, and racial reasons. There is a tennis player named Medvedev who recently complained that Russian players are not being treated well, and was not allowed to play in Wimbledon. This is a big thing in tennis, and I like tennis. Well, I don't really care what Mr. Medvedev has to say, and I'll tell you why. Because there are a lot of Ukrainian athletes that haven't been able to do anything. They can't participate in any form of sport. They're fighting for their homeland. And you know what? A lot of them are dying. Just recently, a professional boxer from Ukraine died fighting for his country. So, if Ukrainians can't attend any of these events, why would someone who is from a country that has deliberately waged war against other people feel empowered to state that they deserve to compete, make money, and enjoy the fruits of their labor when other people are being killed because of the actions of their own country? No, I don't trust Mr. Medvedev at all. And the reason I don't trust him is because he has, in fact, shown historically that he's not of a temperament to be considerate. There was a match that he had with Mr. Donald Young, who is a black man, that Medvedev defaulted. In other words, the entire match was canceled and Donald Young was given the victory because of something Medvedev said. What exactly he said, I don't know. But it would have to be something pretty bad, wouldn't it? What do you think Mr. Medvedev said? Doesn't take much imagination on my part to think what he might have said. So, there is another example. Newsweek. Russia State TV naturally called out Karina as being a dark-skinned anchor in America, etc., etc. They attacked this woman's ethnicity. Why would they do so? Well, for the same reason that many white supremacists do. Because on the exterior, it generates a sense of co-experience. They look at someone who looks differently and they think that that person is different. And it reminds them that they actually have something in common, that their whiteness somehow makes them co-equal. A very odd statement and a very odd experience, but it is something that can be manipulated and taken advantage of. Racial division has historically been something that the Soviets, the KGB, sought to infiltrate and utilize as a weapon to tear apart America. It is something that the CIA and American authorities were aware of. It was one of their great fears of Martin Luther King, a man that I deeply respect, and who I think most people would say now, no, he was no threat to American power. He was not a revolutionary. He simply sought change. And yes, there certainly were probably some elements of infiltration within his group. But the man himself, no. unlikely to have been a complete revolutionary. So why then would a foreign government seek to espouse racial disparity amongst Americans? Well, because there's an element of it here already, of course. But also because, is it possible? Is it possible that a bunch of conservative white old men in Russia, the head of all these secret service groups, might actually be racist? Is it possible? There's a long history of anti-Semitic racism in Russia. If you're not aware of it, it exists. Is it possible that Mr. Putin might actually believe in the racism that his own services are espousing and promoting around the world? You decide. Point number 9. Let's discuss the nature of cleaning up the world from vermin, rats, and insects, and promoting genocide. Quite possibly one of the most terrifying things or moments of clarity that I had was on this exact point. Now, of course, Hitler was famous for making his propaganda films comparing Semitic people to rats. Have you noticed in Putin's speeches that twice he has made references to insects as humans? First, he made the statement that he would spit people out from his mouth like gnats. And I believe he was talking about oligarchs and other people who were sympathetic to the West. The second time I heard the insect comparison was when he mentioned that he wanted the blockade set up, that he wanted his Mariupol blockade to be set up so that not even a fly could get through. That was in USA Today. Now, that might seem like a small thing to you, but of course he doesn't mean flies. He means he doesn't want people to get through. He's comparing people to flies. And of course Ukrainians. It's a very subtle thing, but it's quite specifically there, and it's disturbing to me. Now, the first example I can think of that comes to my mind regarding this comparison is, of course, Kafka, his Metamorphosis, and his review of the anti-Semitism, perhaps, that was occurring at that time and how it was impacting him as a man. Now, this is an allegory about a person who is changing into a huge insect over time, and by the end of the story, the person dies. Kafka is extremely symbolic. He's extremely strange in the way that he presents material. It's also extremely honest in a way. It's terrifyingly honest. It's difficult to know exactly what he is talking about with 100% certainty. But it's fairly clear to most people that he's examining his view of himself over time within a society that he feels hates him. So, let's define genocide then, as it's defined by the UN. The UN defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by killing members of the group, causing bodily or mental harm to the group, deliberately affecting life conditions to bring about destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, forcibly transferring children to another group. That's quite loose, and I feel could be applicable to many nations over time. It has happened historically with quite a disturbing amount of commonality, and of course it happened within my own country when Native American indigenous people were not only killed, but had their own children stolen away from them and taken to schools, forcibly removed and taken from schools, and not allowed to speak their own language. So, let's, now that we have a definition, and we can say this is something that is being deliberately done, and if you've been paying attention at all to the war in Ukraine, you know that this is happening. Let's discuss a few things that are related. First is, I'll give you an article on Roma fighting in Ukraine. I feel there is a wonderful response, as I've already said, from the various ethnic groups, from the Tatars to the Jews to the Roma to Ukrainians, joining together and fighting against the Russians. That's very nice to see. I want to point something out. One is that, of course, these are moral judgments passed on society on other people. My personal relationship is I'm married and I have children. My wife and I are not the same ethnicities. This would have been illegal in the United States, even 100 years ago. So, in some places, it's still deeply frowned upon in many places, in many situations, by many people. Consider that. Consider the nature of that. Even having a heterosexual, monogamous, married relationship that was beyond ethnicity or between people of different ethnicities was frowned upon and illegal in many places in the United States. How can that be? That was something that was considered to be completely inappropriate. So this is something that's been changing over time. And I'm concerned that the nature of the development of refinement of judgment and determination of what is appropriate for every other person is something that is negatively affecting too many people, in my opinion, too many people. There is an article entitled "The Mystery of Disgust" by, I believe it's Eric D'Amato, January of 1998, Psychology Today. Now, because people see things that are different and perhaps elicit a response of disgust, they tend to react negatively to those things, and that emotional reaction is something that can be manipulated and taken advantage of by people who seek to attain power and keep power. And by turning their own citizens upon one another, they maintain their power and indeed increase their power. Now, we all have within us an expectation of normality, of what we consider to be equal to us and are normally sympathetic to. One of the things that first really upset me in this timeline of my own personal events that led up to the making of this video was the drowning of a young Syrian boy, a refugee, on a beach. And I won't give the whole picture here. But in the face of that child, I saw the face of my own children, because the look was so similar. And maybe that's wrong, because you could argue that the actions of men like Putin have caused problems worldwide, including in Africa. So why was I not concerned? Was I just not shown the images from Africa? Why is it that this particular image of this drowned refugee boy on the beach, this waste of life of this child, so disturbing to me? Was it simply because I had a connection to the look of this child? Maybe that's an innately human thing. It's something that can be taken advantage of, though, and I think we all have to recognize that. To finish this particular point, I would just like to end with a simple sentiment, and that is that instead of viewing other human beings as insects and allowing people to form that idea within our heads, that we should recognize the beauty within one another of all human beings. And that has to be something that's felt innately. It's difficult to describe that process. And it's not something that you can force people to do or just tell them about and expect them to really kind of understand. This is one of the wonderful things about the development of multicultural, multi-ethnic America, in my opinion. It innately enables us as a country to enjoy the successes of one another, because we see so many people that are varied, and in that variety we see ourselves. If we embrace that idea that as a country we are mixed, and in a way that's a model for the world, to see that you can treat every person, regardless of ethnicity, orientation, religious belief, size, shape, etc., as a unique and wonderful human being, and to treat them with respect, and to give them the full, appropriate protection of law, then that is something that the rest of the world can model itself on, and hopefully, over time, become something that is more just for all people. Let's move on to topic number 10. The use of corrupt symbols, or the corruption of symbols in general. Now, one of the most famous symbols, of course, that's used by the Nazis and Hitler was the swastika. And you may have heard stories about how it was a symbol that was researched in the Himalayas or the Caucasus and found to have significance. I don't know what kind of silliness that is, but I do know that there are people already using the swastika in World War I. And there are some people that were flying it on their plane. Johan Janssen, Josta 23, had a swastika on his plane. Where did he get the idea? Did he research it in the Caucasus and travel to Tibet to get the symbol? No. Likely he just saw it and thought it was an interesting symbol and put it on his plane. Now, of course, in World War I, we already noted that Hitler was fighting in World War I, and he was, to my knowledge, he was a trench runner, someone that delivered a lot of messages, and was a fairly dangerous job. A lot of the army personnel would see pilots flying and would note, of course, the symbols on the planes. How many German soldiers would have seen that particular symbol on planes? Difficult to know. But did that impact the development of the symbol later? Quite possible. Now, the swastika is a symbol of the sun for many cultures. It is like a wheel. It's meant to be rotating. That's why it has bent arms. It's either rotating in a counterclockwise or a clockwise direction, depending upon which way the arms are bent. So, let's take note of a few things. First is that it's a black symbol. And although this is supposed to be a solar symbol, we have to ask the question, why then would it be black? That's already a little bit disturbing. Obviously, it could be just to make it stand out against the background. But the sun is not black, is it? The idea of the sun being black is quite a disturbing idea. So, if the swastika is, in fact, a solar symbol, what kind of solar symbol is black? An inverted one, obviously. This idea is contained within Soundgarden's song Black Hole Sun. This combination of darkness and solar symbol is consistent for them. Let's note the colors that are used on the Nazi flag: the black, the white, and the red, all absolute colors. Black, darkness and death; white, purity, absolute purity; and red, the sacrifice of blood. Now, red obviously can mean both positive and negative. All colors can be positive and negative. Red can mean fertility, obviously, because women do menstruate. But it's also tied to the fertility of fruit. Many fruits turn red when they're ready to be eaten. And so in a way, red can be a very positive symbol as a color. However, on almost every flag, it is not referring to fertility. Red on a flag or a symbol, in this case, is almost always representative of sacrificial blood. The sacrifice given by people that are fighting for what they believe in. What they choose to believe in, good or bad, varies over time. These same colors, of course, are used by the Crusaders, the Teutonics, the Hospitallers, the Templars: red, white, and black. Over and over again, these colors are used, as are the symbol of the cross. The Nazis have managed, therefore, to take a symbol of the cross and completely corrupt it. As a Christian, there is very little left to the imagination on this point. The bent cross that is black, over purity, and the reference to sacrificial blood is an absolute corruption of the message of Christ. Absolute. Let's move on to the Soviet. I can't explain how incredibly distressing it is to me, as a person that identifies as a Christian, that there are people that consider themselves to be Christian and back a Nazi ideology. There is nothing more corrupt than that symbol. So let's move on to the Soviet symbol. I won't really look at the Chinese flag with its 5 stars. Obviously yellow and red. There again is the red that is not being used in a positive sense, it's being used in a negative sense. The sacrifice of blood. Yellow is a color of elevation. For the 5, of course, the 5 is the representative of the 5 stars of the Politburo, the 5 members of the Politburo, and the one great star that leads them all. Let's look at the Soviet flag. Let's look at this corrupt symbol. Again, a field of red. Notice the 2 symbols, the hammer and sickle. Why are these included here? Supposedly, it's because of the nature of work. They represent the working class. That's the story we've all been told. The workers and the farmers that feed and clothe and manufacture for everyone. That's the nature of the Communist Party. That's what's been told to us. Look at that symbol with new eyes. Read it from left to right. The hammer is a symbol of work, and the sickle is also a symbol of death. Work until you die for the benefit of everyone, for the glory of the state, the sacrifice of all. Work until you die. It's right there in the symbol. It's corrupt, and it's been given to people as a story. Literally look at it, read it, and recognize that it's the same statement that was used on the Nazi death camps. Work will set you free. Work until you die. It's right there in the Soviet symbol. That was the symbol of Putin and the communists as they called themselves communists, but as they were in practice, a cult of death, totalitarians, equivalent to the Nazis, and as Nietzsche said, when you stare into the abyss, it stares back into you. Those two groups were reflections of one another. So, let's continue on with with other symbols. And I want to discuss for a minute this idea of certain symbols being painted on these vehicles in Ukraine. To my knowledge, 3 letters have been used, ZOV. Why those are there, I don't know. Of course, the Sea of Azov is right there, so perhaps it's a reference to Azov. Of course, the Russians don't use these letters. They use Cyrillic. So these are not intrinsic and not known to the people painting them on their vehicles, which means they may be put there for other people to see. Why? Obviously, the Z could be a reference to pop culture. World War Z, which is that movie about zombies and everything else. Zombies which are, of course, easily understood to be a form of metaphor within white power groups for every other person on the planet. The fear of the all-eating mob running wild and devouring everyone. That's so easily assimilated amongst white power movements as a representative of these kind of mindless, brainless immigrants running around and eating everything. It's a very easy way to emotionally pull at the strings of fear within people and manipulate them without them even knowing it. It's one of the reasons I absolutely despise all this zombie garbage. Because it is something that is poison, that poisons people without them even knowing it in a way that they don't recognize. To view other human beings as subhuman. So, let's take a look at what are the possibilities of these symbols. First, I want to point out to you that none of these symbols are male. The Z is again appropriate to a bent cross. It's almost half a swastika. The O or 0 symbol, I've read somewhere has been used, I haven't seen it anywhere. The O0 symbol is almost always a female symbol because of the shape of it as an egg. The next symbol, V, is also a symbol that is associated with female. This goes way back, way back. It is often used in the Middle East history as a symbol for female genitalia. And of course, the letter V stands for, or can be used as a representative for vagina. The fact that the V is female is confirmed by the upward arrow shape being male. We know this is the case, and it's understood on a wide subconscious level because the Spartans used this symbol, lambda, on their shields. Not only is lambda tied to the Laconic Lacedaemonians, who are from Laconia, but also because the upward shape, that A lambda shape, looks like the tip of a spear. And of course the Spartans were famous spearmen, and a spear is of course a phallic symbol. This is all known and combined on their shield. This is all expected, and it's why it was put on their shields. Now we understand the symbol of the pierced heart that is used for Valentine's Day. The heart itself, inverted, is the hourglass shape of the female form, and the arrow is the upward arrow of the male. The male penetrating the female is within that symbol. Everyone subconsciously recognizes it, and it's been used for years by almost everyone, and they don't even recognize the simplicity of that symbol. I want to discuss for a moment the nature of the combination of the male and female. This is the wonder and beauty of a simple symbol. The male and female combination, in other words, the V and the lambda put together, gives you a Star of David. What does that mean? It means symbolically that the male and the female put together gives you a life. The inherent beauty of that sentiment can be captured in many ways. Human life can be portrayed, of course, as a 5-pointed star because we have a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Now that might be geometrically accurate, but for me personally, the Star of David is a philosophical and in some ways a biological representative of who every person is on the planet. They are half of their father and half of their mother, combined into a single person, capturing the beauty of both of those lines of ancestors and all the sacrifices they have made over time. The absolute uniqueness of every person captured within a form, within a life, is within that symbol. It is in many ways the ultimate expression of life. And it was twisted again by the Nazis and used as a demarcation of death. I'll finish with one last symbol discussion. That is the symbol of the stairway going up. The escalator going up, used in many cartoons to denote the elevation to a higher plane. And of course, many people have noted the escalator ride going down, although I fear they do not recognize the subconscious symbolism of that particular moment. I'd like to thank my family for being patient with me for the past few months as I've struggled with these topics, and I'd like to thank you as a viewer for being patient if you're one of my subscribers, for waiting for me to finish this. This has taken a lot out of me, and honestly it's something that I struggled with daily to get done and not to feel overwhelmed with. So I will try to follow up with the next 2 videos in a timely manner. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope it improves the quality of your life, and I hope it benefits society as a whole. Thank you for listening.